Hello, you are in the kitchen with me as I am doing some food prep. I'm experimenting with a couple recipes today, starting off with what I'm calling bean bread. I've had the idea of making a more wholesome homemade bread recipe by including extra grains, beans, and even lentils in the bread. This variation only has beans, but I have tried mixing in ground oats and quinoa previously. I started by grinding 3/4 of a cup of mixed beans and letting that soak in 1 cup of warm water. Then I measure out 1/2 cup of warm water. I make sure to temp the water before mixing in the yeast just to be on the safe side. I like the water to be between 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I almost forgot to add the sugar into the yeast water mix here, which is important because it does help the yeast activate. By the time the bean mixture has rehydrated, it has become a very thick paste. I'm adding 4 tablespoons or 1/4 of a cup of vegetable oil. I'm mixing this in before adding the flour so it incorporates better into the mix as opposed to making big oil clumps. And now we are adding 3 cups of flour and stirring this up. The beans have soaked up so much of the water we added earlier, so this isn't mixing well. So I do add the yeast and water mixture, but I can tell it is still too dry. I end up adding about 1/2 cup of additional water in 1/4 cup increments, which I think in the end does end up being too much. Even after letting the bread rest for 10 minutes, which usually helps a sticky dough become more easy to work with, this isn't enough to help this bread, so I do lay down quite a bit of flour to help with the kneading process. The flour does help make the bread a lot easier to work with. However, I do find if I add too much flour that the bread can become dry and not very pleasant to eat. Like I said, this recipe is still in the works. I will have to keep playing around to figure out the ideal measurements, but I love how beautifully speckled this dough is. I think it is absolutely gorgeous. Now we get to let the dough rise for about an hour while I work on my next experiment, which is homemade tofu. I've done this once before, but it has been so long. So it's kind of like I'm doing it for the first time. I'm starting with 2 cups soybeans, which were soaking in water overnight, and 4 cups of water, and blending this mixture very thoroughly. Next, we have to strain the tofu. I'm doing this in batches to let the soy milk drain out. It's the soy milk that we want, which is going to help us make our tofu later. This ends up working out perfectly. While I'm letting the soy milk drain, I can go ahead and turn my attention back to the bread, which has rested at this point for about an hour and is ready to be shaped. For whatever reason, I can never divide bread evenly into thirds, but you're gonna see I'm trying my best here. The dough is still a little sticky to work with, and I did not have the foresight to lay down flour on this cutting board, so the bread does stick to the cutting board quite a bit. After we've divided it into the 3 pieces, I'm going to go ahead and put the dough into the greased bread tins. And now the bread has to rise for another 20 minutes or so. The oven is preheating in the back, so I'm going to go ahead and lay these trays on top of the oven so it still stays warm. It is pretty cold in my house, and bread doesn't tend to rise well when it is cold. While the bread is resting and the soy milk is draining, I'm going to get started on dinner. Today I'm making red lentil curry. This is based on the Rainbow Plant Life's red lentil curry recipe, along with a few adaptations. These adaptations are mostly based on what I have currently in my fridge. The original recipe, for example, does not call for onion, but I had just a little bit of leftover onion that I wanted to get used up, so I'm going to go ahead and throw it in this curry. The recipe also calls for serranos, but I'm swapping these for jalapenos since I don't have serranos on hand. At this point, the bread is ready to go in the oven to bake for 20 minutes. For this recipe, I'm frying up the aromatics and then toasting up the spice blend quickly before adding the rest of the ingredients. I will also add 1 cup of red lentils and a large can of diced tomatoes, as well as some water and some veggie bouillon paste. Then I let the curry simmer on the back burner while I focus on the soy milk. At this point, I was getting really hungry, but lucky for me, the bread was ready to come out of the oven at this point. After letting the soy milk sit with the coagulant for about 15 minutes, it has begun to curdle and it is ready to be strained and pressed. I'm again using cheesecloth and pouring the mixture in batches so it doesn't overflow. And after pressing the tofu for about an hour, it is ready. Now, I was so excited to try this tofu, I had to have it almost immediately. So I did go ahead and have it with some soy sauce and sesame seeds and green onions. This is not the way I usually like eating tofu, but like I said, I was so excited I couldn't wait any longer to try it. Which does bring us to the end of my food prep day, and thank you so much for watching.